The RWBY web series and video games are a bit of a mixed bag. Team RWBY's inclusion in BlazBlue Cross-Tag Battle was pretty cool, whereas their standalone game Grim Eclipse wasn't. But they're back in the gaming world with a side-scrolling platformer with companies like Arc System and WayForward behind them. So, how do they transition into the world of side-scrollers? Let's find out. Here is my review of RWBY Arrowfell for the Nintendo Switch. Arrowfell takes place during RWBY Volume 7. Team RWBY has been officially inducted into the Atlas Academy as licensed huntresses and are given their first mission when a spike in Grim activity in the area becomes an issue. The story follows RWBY and her friends as they visit old acquaintances like Winter and Penny as they uncover this mystery and try to fit in at Atlas. Now, I think the story here isn't too bad. A bunch of returning characters and reference to older events of the RWBY series are here, and many of the bigger events are fully animated like you're watching the show. Also, it's apparently canon. But there's one thing we should note. This is clearly made for fans of the series. You get zero explanation of who Team RWBY are or anything else in general about the world. The intro just states that Team RWBY's inducted into Atlas Academy, so there's a ton of information thrown around that the game expects you to already know. So if you're new to the series, I suggest watching volumes 1 through 6 beforehand. When it comes to gameplay, Arrowfell is a side-scrolling platformer with 3D visuals and some upgrade elements. As you trek through the game, you'll platform and fight enemies in hack-and-slash combat, fighting items for quests as you explore around. Now, the main gameplay loop is in chapters. Each chapter opens up new dungeons and towns for you to explore on the map, each with their own little side quests and NPCs to give you missions for the main story. Now, all areas follow the same gameplay format. They're large side-scrolling dungeons with platforms to climb and different paths to explore. Even towns are like platforming dungeons but smaller and without enemies running around trying to fight you. Navigation through these dungeons is pretty simple. You run around the platforms and fight whatever enemies are patrolling around and attacking you. And there's a bit of choice here. Some rooms have enemies you can maneuver around and move on, while other rooms are called ambush rooms, locking you in until you clear all of the enemies. I find this formula kind of a mix between Castlevania and Mega Man. The platforming and especially the save rooms really give off huge Castlevania and Bloodstained vibes, but the rooms locking you in and many of the projectile attacks you can use, especially the one from Ruby Rose, really gives off Mega Man vibes. Though I will admit that this is a very light dungeon crawler. You aren't going to get some crazy maze like you get in Bloodstained. There are a ton of small dungeons in the game that just have a few paths around for you to navigate. Normally with only a few linear paths available from the get-go, with the other 1 or 2 paths in each dungeon blocked off by some obstacle you have to get an ability later on in the game to get past. They're very linear with just enough variance to have little boxes and chests here and there to get upgrades and collectibles from. The rest of the game in these light dungeons is combat. You're always playing as the entirety of Team RWBY throughout the game, being able to freely swap characters at any time to change up playstyles. From the lightning fast punches and shockwaves of Yang to the powerful scythe slashes and cloaking dashes of Ruby Rose. Everyone handles physical and projectile attacks a little differently, so it's fun to swap and experiment around. And you'll have to swap for exploration anyways. Lots of puzzles are in the game that each character's special ability will be needed to get past. From crossing large gaps with Ruby's cloaking dash to creating platforms with Wace's ice magic. The combat itself feels pretty good. All of the Grim have different patterns that you have to learn as you move around and learn every different enemy. And like I said just now, everybody has a different playstyle. You can technically solo the entire game with your favorite character, at least outside of swapping for puzzles. How do I know? Because I spent probably 95–98% of my entire playthrough just using Ruby Rose. But you're definitely meant to swap around, especially when you get to some of the later bosses where certain characters' abilities are really the key to fighting off certain attacks. But we should talk about the unique part of this game, which is the energy gauge. As you down enemies in various parts of the environment, you can collect green magic energy, which is used to use your projectile attacks, like Ruby's very Mega Man-like blaster. But it's also tied to your health. When you take damage from enemies, you don't immediately lose a heart out of your maximum health. You lose energy, and once the energy gauge is depleted, then you lose a heart whenever you're hit. And the cool part is that some of the energy gauge will automatically refill if you're not hit for a while. So it gives you a little bit of strategy. Do I want to use my entire energy gauge to fire off these projectiles and risk losing hearts, or do I want to just stick to physical attacks and evading to make sure that I have that buffer? And all of these stats and mechanics are enhanced as you play. There are hidden upgrades in the dungeons and many merchant shops that you can use for upgrades. Buy a heart from each different merchant to increase your maximum health, and gain skill points to be able to enhance the stats and abilities of each character, from attack damage to how much energy automatically recharges once you're hit. And this is a very, very easy system to use. If you just want to max out your favorite character with skill points, you can easily get them to max out on everything before you're even halfway through the game. As far as the difficulty goes, all of the enemies in the game are pretty approachable. For the first half of the game, you can just run and button mash your way through pretty much everything and be fine as long as you're upgrading. But the further you go, the more you have to learn patterns. This is especially true for bosses, as it isn't a difficult game to play, but you have to learn patterns to not get torn apart by the late game. I went into a couple of the boss fights getting absolutely destroyed for the first couple of minutes, and after I'd learned their attacks, I was running circles around them. And as you clear dungeons, or the ambush rooms of dungeons that are protecting treasure rooms, you get items for the mini quests. Now, I won't say these are side quests because really they're not. The way they come up in each chapter makes them feel like side quests. Oh, this NPC needs this, this, and this, so it's probably some optional thing I can do. Actually, no, most of them are not optional. Doing one side quest will typically give you an item you need for another side quest that gives you an upgrade that is required for story progress. So really, you do have to do everything in order to complete each chapter and finish the game. And while I did really like the gameplay here, there are two things that I wasn't a fan of. The really short dungeons can lead to repetition. Some chapters have you doing so many little fetch quests and going into a micro dungeon for only a couple minutes and doing it again in 4 other dungeons that it can feel a little repetitive. And then there's the balance between maxing out damage and the late game enemies. Early on in the game, bosses are tanky as you upgrade your character, and things level out in the length of bosses once you max out your attack. But the balance will slowly disappear around chapter 4 when bosses all get stronger and much more tanky and beefy, with health so high that it feels like you're just slowly punching and punching and punching, waiting for the boss fight to eventually end. It is so much to the point that in the last chapter I was expecting some story MacGuffin to happen that was going to increase everyone's stats to level things out, but it didn't. And now let's go into content and length, which isn't too bad. The game is about $30, and my first trek through it took me around 6 hours. Unfortunately, there isn't really post-game content here, since almost all the quests are mandatory, at least outside of searching for skill points. And when you beat the game, there's no real new game plus. You just reloaded the last save point and can do anything you didn't do before. But let's go into presentation, which surprised me. Being from Arc System Works and WayForward, I expected this to be a 2D platformer akin to games like Blood Rain Betrayal, but this is actually a 3D side-scroller. And in this way, it looks pretty good. I will admit there's a bit of weirdness and style difference between both the cutesy artwork and scenes and in-game renders, and between the animated scene renders and the more chibi gameplay renders. But it does all look good. And performance, I have very few complaints about. There are occasional frame dips in combat, but mostly in handheld mode, and they aren't all that often. And that's all I've got for that, so let's go into battery life. On the original model, we get a range of 2 hours and 37 up to 2 hours and 53. The Nintendo Switch Lite gets a range of 2 hours and 46 up to 3 hours and 18. The Redboxer V2 2019 model gets a range of 5 hours and 11 up to 6 hours and 3. And the OLED model gets a range of 5 hours and 25 up to 6 hours and 22. In conclusion, RWBY comes back to the gaming and handheld world with a game that is probably the best RWBY game to date. Now, on the downside, you have to be in the know about the franchise to be able to understand the story. The damage balance does seem a bit too spongy in the late game, and there are a few frame hiccups here and there in handheld mode. But if you're a fan of the series and want more Team RWBY on the go, it's not a bad platformer. Reviews to Go rates RWBY Arrowfell for the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.